Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil is a notoriously difficult book to understand. Written in 1886, it has become hugely influential but also widely misunderstood. In this series, we will explore the main themes of one of the most puzzling and infamous works in all of philosophy. We hope that after watching this series, you will have a solid grasp of the main ideas in the work, but more importantly, that you will understand Nietzsche's unique way of looking at the world. This is the first video in a planned 3-part series on just this one work by Nietzsche. We want it to be a detailed deep dive into the book. This first video will be something of a warm-up, or a teaser, if you will. If you want to be notified when we release the other videos in this series, please consider subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's dive into this fascinating work. Part 1. The title. The full title of the work actually reads Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. Let's dissect the meaning of this lengthy title. Beyond Good and Evil gives us a clue as to what Nietzsche is trying to accomplish here. He wants us to go beyond the concepts of good and evil. What does this mean? Historically, philosophers have been operating under the assumption that any given act is either good or evil. This is a moral value judgment. When we say, he did a good thing, we are paying someone a compliment. By contrast, a bad thing or an evil act is seen as the opposite of good. In the first part of the title, Nietzsche is inviting us to look beyond this binary mode of thinking. As we will see, Nietzsche does not propose, as the philosophers before him have done, that good is the opposite of evil. In other words, Nietzsche rejects the dichotomy of good versus evil. Traditionally, the good was viewed as something entirely different and opposite from evil. Nietzsche will attack this presupposition. In a broader sense, this first part of the title also invites us to look beyond any pair of opposites, not just good and evil. Nietzsche is asking us to go beyond good and evil, but as we will see, he will also ask us to look beyond appearance and reality, beyond will and reason, beyond true and false. As will be seen, Beyond Good and Evil is a work in which Nietzsche attacks the very idea of a contradiction. All of this intellectual baggage is apparent from just the first 4 words of the title. The subtitle, then, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, is often not mentioned, but it also gives us important information as to what Nietzsche is trying to accomplish here. Firstly, this book is a prelude. It's a teaser, a starting point, a warm-up. It is not a finished, polished product and not a grand philosophical system. More importantly, it's not meant to be any of these things, and Nietzsche himself was acutely aware of this. Nietzsche wanted to kickstart a new philosophical movement and way of thinking, and he wanted others to continue his work. Beyond Good and Evil is full of appellations to the so-called free spirits whom Nietzsche invites to take philosophy forward, a philosophy of the future. All of this we have learned just from looking at the title. In the following parts, we will see how exactly Nietzsche wants us to go beyond good and evil. Part 2. Philosophical Prejudices. Throughout Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche exposes several prejudices philosophers have. Most philosophers think they are searching for the truth with a clear objective method. They assume they undertake this search without prejudice, that is to say, without any preconceived notions that might cloud their judgment. Just like how a surgeon would use sterilized, clean equipment for his work, the philosopher tries to use clean and clear logical thoughts. A dirty knife might botch the surgery and make things worse. And in the same way, logically fuzzy, metaphorically dirty thoughts might similarly result in a botched philosophy. Nietzsche's goal in Beyond Good and Evil is to show that the so-called great philosophers before him have actually been using dirty knives all along without being aware of it. Maybe you have heard people call Nietzsche the philosopher with a hammer. If you have, this is what they mean by that. Nietzsche has a real talent for delivering destructive blows to the great philosophers of the past, exposing in their work biases at play that have gone unnoticed for a very long time. Nietzsche, with his hammer, sets out to destroy these philosophies and pave the way for a new philosophy of the future without the biases of the past. What kind of biases is Nietzsche talking about? Let's take, for example, René Descartes. The entire project of Descartes, from the ground up, was designed to eliminate bias. Using his famous method of doubt, Descartes set out to find a starting point on which to base all of our knowledge. This foundational knowledge must be so certain, it should be impossible to possibly doubt it. We cannot be sure, for example, of the accuracy of our senses. We cannot know whether we are dreaming or not. We cannot even be sure if other people view the world in the same way as we do. But what cannot be doubted is that I think. Even if I doubt the fact that I am thinking, I can at least be sure of my doubt itself. But to doubt, of course, means to think. So Descartes arrives at his famous formulation, I think, therefore I am. This little fact is true no matter what, because in order to think, something must exist to do the thinking. So Descartes assumed he had found the one and only thing of which we can always be sure. I think, therefore I am. Nietzsche asks, is that really the furthest you can go? He identifies a lot of hidden assumptions in Descartes' reasoning. For instance, that it is I who think, that there must necessarily be something that thinks, that thinking is an activity and operation on the part of a being who is thought of as a cause, that there is an ego, and finally, that it is already determined what is to be designated by thinking, that I know what thinking is. In other words, to say, I think, Descartes already presupposes the existence of an I, which is exactly what he is trying to prove in the first place. Descartes is moving in circles, but that's not the whole story. Descartes has not even sufficiently proved that there is a singular I which is doing the thinking. By using the word I, he is already overstepping the bounds of acceptability. Instead, Descartes should have said something like, there are thoughts, or it is thinking, just like we say, it is raining. By attacking Descartes, the most famous and influential example of the philosopher of doubt, Nietzsche is attacking the entire philosophical tradition before himself. If even Descartes, even the famous doubter of all things, did not go far enough at his job, where does that leave the rest of the philosophers? In effect, Nietzsche wants to show that even the best surgeon in the world is still using dirty tools to get the job done. Nietzsche's criticism of Descartes' ego is part of a bigger attack on what he calls the atomistic need of philosophers. What is this atomistic need? Let's use a famous example of philosopher Gilbert Ryle. A foreigner visiting Oxford or Cambridge for the first time is shown a number of colleges, libraries, playing fields, museums, scientific departments, and administrative offices. He then asks, but where is the university? I have seen where the members of the colleges live, where the registrar works, where the scientists experiment and all the rest. But I have not yet seen the university in which reside and work the members of your university. The mistake here is obvious. The person visiting Oxford assumes that the university is a singular building instead of a collection of campuses, buildings, and people. He expects to see the one University of Oxford, when in reality, the university is a collection of buildings scattered throughout the medieval city of Oxford. Philosophers make a similar mistake when they want to look for one self, one drive, one world, one God. The grammatical structure of our language tricks us into thinking that things are atomistic. That is to say, we tend to think of things as undivided wholes instead of collections or relationships of multiple things. So, a philosopher like Schopenhauer might say, there is only one will to life. And Descartes might say, I think. But for Nietzsche, the will is actually a collection of drives and instincts, and the self is a collection of thoughts, just like the University of Oxford is a collection of buildings instead of one big singular building. Beyond Good and Evil is full of critiques of old philosophies of the past. Too much to cover in a single video. But most philosophical prejudices arise from one big misconception most philosophers have had. One assumption that seems so obvious no one has seriously thought to doubt it. Something so obvious it often gets overlooked. What is this so-called mother of all assumptions? Truth is preferable to falsehood. Nietzsche simply asks, why? And, more importantly, he sets out to show that most philosophers' search for truth is actually a hidden front for something different, that their so-called noble search for objective truth is not as disinterested and noble as it might seem, that in searching for the truth, the philosopher is actually trying to do something else. That the philosopher, in other words, has an ulterior motive. Gaining power. In the second video in this series, we will explore Nietzsche's famous concept of the will to power in more detail. And we will also see where these philosophical prejudices come from. If you want to be notified when the second video in this series is released, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell button. We are planning a 3-part series on just Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil alone. If you want more content on Nietzsche, please like and share this video, as it massively helps out the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in part 2.